Harry and Ginny led Godric Gryffindor to the area that would eventually become the second floor's girls' bathroom. They were forced to stop when they found the door to the bathroom shut and magically locked. "Professor Slytherin's personal bathroom. Stay out," was painted on the stout oak door. Ginny pulled out her wand and pointed it at the lock, which was shaped like a coiled serpent.
"Aloha Mora!"
she shouted and flicked her wand. The lock spat out gold-colored sparks from the serpent's mouth, but remained firmly locked. Harry pulled out his wand and pointed it at the door. "I have an idea," he told Ginny. She stepped to the side to give him room to cast his spell. He mentally made the switch from English to Parseltongue and uttered the same spell Ginny had just tried. There was an audible click as the door unlocked itself and then swung inward. Harry bowed and motioned with his arm to welcome the other two into the room. As Godric strode into the room, he glanced down at Harry, curious. "You never told me you were a parcel mouth," he informed the shorter man. Harry sighed deeply and then replied, "Long story." Godric nodded, eagerly awaiting the opportunity to sit around several steins of butterbeer and listen to that story. Once Godric and Ginny were inside, Harry shut the door behind them and walked over to the ornate sink in the middle of the floor. Again he used Parseltongue to command the sink to open. The sink split into several sections and revealed a very steep, sloping tunnel underneath. Harry jumped into the tunnel before Ginny or Godric could react. He was unwilling to let his friends face whatever was at the end of the passage before he did. Ginny shrugged and jumped in after her boyfriend. Godric looked at the tunnel and shook his head. He was proud that two such courageous young people had been sorted into his house. They had just done something that made his insides weak. As a large-framed man, he had never been fond of tight places. He swallowed his fear and muttered a few choice words describing Salazar's heritage before jumping after them. During the long slide to the cavern that housed the Chamber of Secrets, Harry took the time to notice the differences 1,000 years could make. The tunnel walls were clean, instead of streaked with a millennium of grime. The most notable difference was the vastly improved smell. He guessed it must have been some time in the future before the castle extended its sewers this deep. The tunnel opened up into the roof of the cavern that led to the Chamber of Secrets. He dropped from the ceiling and landed on his backside. Sounds above him warned him that someone else was on their way down, and Harry scooted out of the way. Ginny sensed, rather than saw, the tunnel opening out in the cavern ceiling. She landed on her feet and then dove into a shoulder roll to burn off momentum. Cursing and yelling came down the tunnel shortly after, and soon Godric was deposited in a heap on the floor. He stood up, a fierce snarl on his face. "I think Salazar did that on purpose. The monkey-faced bastard knows I really don't like cramped places," he swore. His scowl turned into a grin as he looked at Harry. "Old Snakebutt should have remembered what you taught us. Courage isn't the lack of fear. It's acknowledging you're afraid and doing what needs to be done in spite of it," he quoted. Harry wondered briefly about the nature of paradoxes. What Godric had just said was one of the first lessons all Gryffindor students learned during their first year. It was even written above the doorway leading out of the dorm. He shook his head to clear it and motioned for Godric to follow him. "The chamber is this way. Come on," he prompted, and started walking cautiously towards the end of the cavern. As they made their way, the three Gryffindors came across several shed snakeskins. They ranged in size from a mere meter in length to over 10 meters long, still a far cry from the 20-meter one Harry and Ron encountered in their second year. Eventually, they reached the chamber's entrance and found the door open. They could see a man dressed in a robe made of emerald and black silk standing at the rear of the Chamber of Secrets. They entered the chamber as quietly as they could. Godric motioned to either side of the central path. "You two, make your ways along the sides. I need to see if I can talk Salazar out of this. I owe him that much," he whispered. Harry and Ginny nodded and crept off behind the pillars shaped like snakes on opposite sides of the path. Godric gave them a moment to sneak away, and then started walking down the center of the aisle. Salazar Slytherin turned his bald head to the side for a moment as he heard loud, familiar footsteps behind him. He looked into the water in front of the giant statue for a moment before whispering something in Parseltongue. When he was done, he turned around to look at his old friend. "You shouldn't have come, Godric," he told the bear of a man walking towards him. "I had to try and talk you out of this ridiculous course of action, Salazar," Godric replied gravely.
Ridiculous? Ridiculous, you say? Salazar spat. Ridiculous is you standing up for the Muggles and their spawn after everything they've done to me. To us! He shouted. You were my closest friend. You should be standing with me rather than against me as I try to rid the world of their filth, he implored.
That is not what Merlin taught us, Godric stated sadly. Salazar took a step towards his friend, desperately wanting him to see things his way.
Merlin abandoned us, or have you forgotten? It was only his guidance that kept the Muggles in check. After he left, Camelot fell and the Muggles turned on us, he reminded Godric.
Godric shook his head sadly. I know you hurt, but you can't take it out on the innocent.
Innocent? Salazar shouted. How dare you use that word to describe Muggles? He fumed. Need I remind you of what they took from both of us? He demanded.
Godric refused to meet Salazar's eyes.
She was your sister! Damn it! You stood by me at the altar while I married Gertrude. You were with me when we found what remained of her tied to a stake after being burned alive by the Muggles, simply because she was different from them, he shouted.
Aye, Salazar. What you say is true, Godric acknowledged. It's also true that I rounded up the village elders with you and helped you execute them. After that, I stopped you from killing everyone else in the village, Godric responded. Not every Muggle is evil, and neither are the wizards and witches born from them, he tried to point out for what seemed like the 100th time. They had been having this argument ever since they found the remains of his sister. Things came to a head when Godric, backed by Helga, and eventually Rowena, voted to allow half-bloods and even Muggle-born magical children into their school. Salazar sighed deeply before speaking again.
It seems we are at an impasse, my old friend, he pronounced. Soon, my army above will shake the defenses of the school, and my newest creation will cleanse it from the inside, he promised.
Godric squared his shoulders and smirked at Salazar. I'm afraid I have to give you some bad news. As for your army, I believe Rowena, Helga, and some people we bumped into in Diagon Alley should be able to take care of them, he boasted. Salazar raised one thin eyebrow, inviting Godric to continue. Isn't it always amazing how the Lady of the Lake and her consort, Lord Merlin, always show up when we need them the most, he mused. Salazar scoffed at the other man's words.
Do you take me for a simpleton? He demanded. I sincerely doubt that Merlin and Hermione just happened to show up, he said with a sneer.
Godric went on, ignoring Salazar's comments. As for the basilisk, I think the three of us can handle a snake, no matter how big, he stated confidently. Salazar was about to question Godric's counting skills when Harry and Ginny stepped out of the shadows. He swallowed quickly as he recognized them. His stomach fell as he realized that with the two of them there, it was entirely possible for Merlin and Hermione to be topside.
Now!
He yelled in Parseltongue and covered his eyes with his arm. Godric reached for his sword, but he was knocked unconscious before he could use it. The basilisk had slammed into his head from behind before slithering off into the pool.
Harry, protect Professor Gryffindor and see if you can drag him to the door. I have a score to settle,
Ginny yelled while ripping off a piece of her robe. She tied it across her eyes while Harry ran to protect Godric. He knelt down next to the slumbering man and erected an opaque shield that fit over them like a tiny igloo. The black hemisphere jerked a few feet at a time as Harry tried dragging the much larger man back towards the entrance. Salazar had put his arm down temporarily to see what was happening when he heard the basilisk slide into the water again as it moved to strike from somewhere else. He laughed at what Ginny was doing.
Do you honestly think that will help you, girl? Or do you just not want to see the end coming? He taunted.
He had no way of knowing that Ginny was able to use her hearing, as well as her temporal senses, to locate things in the room. She rolled out of the way just as the basilisk struck at her from the water to her left. The poisonous fangs managed to leave a long tear in her robe, but failed to actually touch her. Ginny was thinking hard to come up with a way to save her, Harry, and Godric. She was hampered by the knowledge that she had to make sure the basilisk lived through their encounter since she and Harry faced it 1,000 years from now in the future. even though she was her father's daughter. The soldier part of her mind told her she had to do whatever she needed to in order to protect herself and those she cared for. She timed her next move so she could make a dash for Salazar Slytherin as she dodged the basilisk again. She lifted up her impromptu blindfold for just a split second, allowing Ginny to confirm where Salazar was standing. 2 quick steps and a forward somersault brought her directly in front of the head of Slytherin House. She drew back her arm and punched him in the mouth with all of her martial skill. Salazar stumbled back and spit out his front teeth.
You bitch! You hit me!
He lisped indignantly. Ginny felt the warm wetness of Salazar's blood on her hand.
Rough part about controlling a basilisk is you have to speak Parseltongue. Pretty hard to do when you can't make a sound anymore,
she pointed out before racing back towards the door where Harry was lifting Godric through. Harry finally managed to get Godric through the door, wondering if the founder might actually be as heavy as Hagrid. Ginny's voice carried down the center aisle, letting him know what she had done. He closed his eyes and faced the chamber again. "Feed on the one bleeding," he suggested in Parseltongue. The basilisk heard him and darted his tongue out to taste the air. It did smell the sweet, coppery taste of blood, and slowly slithered toward the source. Salazar shoved his tongue into the gap where his front teeth used to be. No matter how hard he tried, the lack of teeth made it impossible to make the sound Ginny had described. He covered his eyes with his arms again as he turned around slowly, trying to figure out where his precious basilisk had gone to. He mumbled and lisped, but was unable to speak to the giant snake he had magically bred from a rooster's egg, fertilized by a toad. Ginny jumped through the door, and Harry commanded it to shut and seal itself, as they heard Salazar scream once in agony as the basilisk struck. The large door swung shut, and the multitude of engraved serpents sprang out to lock and seal the door, until Tom Riddle would come along eventually to unlock them once again. Godric moaned and sat up, rubbing the back of his head. He looked at first Ginny, and then Harry. "I'm guessing since that we're still alive, Salazar isn't?" he inquired. Harry knelt down next to Godric. "I never really knew how close you two were. I'm sorry for your loss," he offered. Godric clasped Harry's arms tightly. "I had to try and save him from himself one last time. He made his choices, and now he has paid for them," he said sadly. Harry helped Godric stand up. "Well, we might as well go see how the others fared," he suggested, and took them each by the hand. He closed his eyes and apparated all 3 of them to the castle courtyard above them.